Hello and welcome to another CS0 Intro to Java Programming video. In this video I'm going to demonstrate how to use variables along with drawing skills. We've looked at this in previous videos, but I'm going to go a little bit more in depth with it. I'm going to talk about doing some calculations and reusing variables and such like that. So let's get into it. I'm going to run this class first so you can see what it actually does. We've got the input dialog here from JOption pane, and this is used to get user input. So I'm going to enter the X origin for a box. I'm going to put it at 50. I'm going to enter the Y origin, 50, so it's going to be at 50 and 50 is the origin of this box. The X for the lower right-hand corner of the box is going to be 150. The Y is going to be 150. So it'll be a square going from 50-50 to 150-150. So it'll be a 100 by 100 box. Now I'm going to enter a horizontal shift and Y shift, which will be used to draw another box. It's going to shift the box over by this shift value from the original box. So I'm going to have it shift over 150 pixels horizontally and 200 pixels vertically. Click OK, and you can see it drew my first box here and then my second box here. These are 100 by 100 pixel boxes. This one is shifted over by 100 and down by 150. All right, let's take a look at the code that does this. I have a bunch of variables here. I've got variables for X origin, Y origin, X end, Y end, height, and width. So X origin and Y origin are going to be where the first box will show up. X end, Y end will be the lower right-hand corner of that box, and that'll help us to calculate the height and width of the box that we're going to use in the drawRect method call. Then I've got my X and Y shift, which are going to, as you saw, draw the second rectangle shifted over by those values. And then I've got a string called input. We'll see why we have the string called input in just a minute. This is a JFrame, so like always, we're going to do our JFrame stuff. We're going to instantiate our object from the using variables class, and the object is called frame. This is going to be the first video where we're actually going to use that object for more than just calling methods like set size and set visible and stuff like that. We're going to have to get variables from that object, and I'll talk a little bit about that, and hopefully I can explain it well. Next, getInputs method. I create a method called getInputs. Remember how methods work. I've got this object called frame. It's of type using variables. So what's going to happen is Java is going to look for a method called getInputs in the class that this object comes from. The class that it comes from is using variables. So it's going to look in the using variables class for a method called getInputs. If it can't find it, then it'll search for it somewhere else. It'll search for it in the JFrame class. But I created a method called getInputs, so it'll find it in the using variables class. So let's scroll down and find it. Here's my getInputs. GetInputs is going to be used to make all these method calls to the showInput dialog method. So JOption pane, showInput dialog. I'm going to really quickly go to the API here. Search Java, JOption pane. The API is the listing of all of the classes and libraries and packages and stuff like that, all of the technologies that you can find in Java. And it's going to give a description of what that technology is and all of the things it has available to it. So in this case, it's a class called JOption pane, and it's going to describe what that class does, and it's going to describe all of the variables and fields and methods and constructors available to us. You can see that JOption pane comes from Swing from JavaX. We've used Swing components before, things like any of the J components. JFrame, for example, JPanel, JTextField, all of those are Swing components. So JOption pane comes from JComponent, which comes from container, which comes from component from AWT, which comes from object. Here's the description of JOption pane. It's going to tell us what it does. It's a pretty long description. And then we've got a little bit of the class summary and then a field summary. These are going to be all the constants that are available to us. And there are a lot of them. Then we've got the constructor summary, and there are several constructors. We're not going to use the constructor for our purposes. We're just going to use some methods. And this is the method summary. And we're going to go down to the show input dialog and stuff like that. These are all the ones that we're going to use. All of these ones that say static are the ones that we are going to use for the purposes of our class. A static method is a method that is called to a class and not to an object. We've seen methods that are called to objects. For example, setVisible has to be called to an object of type JFrame. So ours is using variables. We're calling it to that because it is a JFrame. That's an instance method. It needs an object to be called to. Static methods, however, don't need an object, so we call them to the class. We want show input dialog, and that's going to be one of these right here. The one we're going to use is the one that's just going to take a message in like this, or the one that's going to take in a parent component and the message. The parent component is going to be the thing that the input dialog is going to center on when it pops up. So let's take a look at that call. Go into get inputs. JOption pane, show input dialog. And as I said, JOption pane is the class, show input dialog is a static method. So you can see we're calling it to the class. We don't have to do JOption pane gets new JOption pane. I don't have to do that. I don't have to go pane dot show. In fact, there's no show input dialog for an object of type JOption pane. This is a static method. It's called to the class. So show input dialog. I'm gonna have it observe this. In other words, it's gonna pop up on the JFrame, and then I enter my message. Enter the X origin for your box. Now, what's going to happen is that pop-up box will show up, and it's going to have the text field in it, just like we saw. I'll run it again. See? And then it's going to have this text field, and it's going to take a value into it, so 50. When I hit OK, it's going to accept that 50, and it's going to take that 50 into this method and then return it. When I say it returns it, it's going to spit it out at this location. And we need to pick that value up. We need to store it in a variable. So I've got my string variable here called input. Input is going to take in the return from that method. Now, I want to make sure that I pass an int value into it, or an integer. I pass a number into that field. If I don't pass a number into it, I'm going to have a problem. And here's why. I've got a variable here called X origin that you saw at the top in my variables list. And X origin is meant to take in whatever comes out of this call to show input dialog. What we need to do, though, is since input is a string and what comes out of JOption pane is a string, we need to convert it to an integer because we need to do calculations with it. When we think about draw rectangle and draw line, which we're going to use both of, they both require integers for their arguments, not strings. So I have to convert this to an integer. So I'm going to do that through the parseInt method of the integer class. ParseInt is also a static method. We're calling it to the integer class instead of an object of integer type. So integer.parseInt, and we pass that string into it, and if it is, pardon me, if it is a numeric string, it's going to take that numeric string and transform it into an integer and store it in that variable. I'm going to do that the same thing for Y origin. So I use input dialog, enter the Y origin, store it in input, parse it. We'll do the same thing for X end, for Y end, for X shift, and for Y shift. So this getInputs method is just going to retrieve user input and parse all those values into integers. Now, the important thing that I want to show you with this is how I'm reusing variables. when do you reuse variables and why do you reuse variables? We reuse variables because we want to make sure that we're using as little space in our class as is necessary. The more variables you use, the more space you're taking up in memory. Now, if you've got a very small system that you're running your software on, or you've got a very large program, the more variables you have could be really problematic for the type of computer that you're running on. Let's say you've got a really huge piece of software, and it's a real memory hog. Think of something like Adobe's Lightroom or Adobe Photoshop. These are enormous pieces of software that are using enormous files and opening up enormous libraries, and they're taking up a lot of space. So every extra variable that you throw into your program is adding to that and ballooning the amount of space it's going to take up. So if you can reuse variables instead of creating new variables, reuse them. We want to reuse them when we don't need that data to be persistent. For example, input. Input is just this temporary storage space where I'm going to store the data that's input by the user as a string before I parse it into an integer. The input here for the X origin only needs to be used in this place right here until I translate it into an int. I don't need that X origin string down here, or for that matter, after I get all the inputs. I only need it right here. Once I parse it into an int and store it in this variable, I don't need it anymore. So I can overwrite that string with another method call. So here I get my Y origin and store it in there. And then I parse it, save it into this variable. Then I don't need the Y origin anymore, and I can replace it. And then I don't need this one anymore. I can replace it, and I keep replacing the input. I can reuse that input variable as many times as I want because the value does not need to be persistent. The reason it doesn't need to be persistent is I only need it as int values later on in the program. So I store those ints in int variables. So that's a little bit about reusing variables, when to do it and why to do it. All right, that's getting our inputs. That's really where we're doing most of our work right now. Next, I've got my height and width, which I'm going to calculate. Because I need height and width for drawing rectangles, right? So what I need to do to get the height and width is I need to find the difference between the origin and the end of my y values and my x values. For height, I'm looking at those two y values and how far apart they are. When we want to know how far apart two things are, we find their difference. So I'm going to do y origin minus y end, and I'm going to take the absolute value of it. The reason I'm taking the absolute value of it is I don't want to have a negative value for width or height, right? I just want to know how many pixels apart they are. It doesn't matter if it's a positive value or negative value, just we want to know how far apart they are. So I call on math.abs, and it's going to take this int in, and it's going to return it as an int. Now, I'm doing something funny here, frame.height. So height is a variable that is an instance variable of the JFrame class, or of the using variables class. The main method is static. Now, not to belabor this point, I'm not going to get too in depth into why, what statics are and how they're supposed to be used, but things that are static cannot access things that are non-static. So if I tried to just directly access height, for example, height gets 25, it's going to say you can't do that. It's going to say non-static field height cannot be referenced from a static context. Well, that's a problem. I could, if I wanted to, make those variables static, but I won't. That starts running us into real problems. You never want to make variables static unless absolutely necessary. In fact, about the only time you're going to make variables static is going to be for constants, class constants. For variables like this, for class variables, you want to keep them instance variables. Well, we have ways of getting those instance variables, and that's through an instance or through an object. So frame is an object of this class. Remember that. We've been doing this all along. We've been using instance methods on that object. So frame is an object of type using variables. These are instance variables for the using variables class. So every time I create an object of using variables, if I create an object called frame, or I could create an object called frame2 or frame3 or frame4, all of those are going to have their own sets of instance variables. Now to access those instance variables for those objects, I need to do it through the class name, or through the object name. So frame.height is going to get the height variable for the object frame, because it has its own set of height and width variables. So that's why I'm doing this. I only need to do that in the constructor. In other methods that aren't static, I don't have to do that. If I did this, static, you're going to see all of these are going to say, hey, you can't do that. But I'm not making these methods static. These are instance methods, and I call them to the class. See that? So I call it to this instance frame, frame.getInputs, frame.height, frame.width. So I'm getting the difference between the y's, getting the difference between the x's, and that's going to set my height and width. All right, that's the end of my main method. Let's take a look at paint. In paint, all I'm doing is calling to super like always, doing my anti-aliasing like always, and then I'm drawing my two rectangles. First rect is going to be drawn using x origin and y origin, and then the width and the height that I calculated earlier. And then the second rectangle, I'm going to use my x shift and y shift. When I add the x shift to it, it's going to push that rectangle over by the x shift value. So if I had the x shift be 100, the x origin of my second rectangle is going to be 100 pixels over from it. And the y origin is going to be 100 pixels over from the down from the original y. So that's going to draw my two rectangles as I demonstrated before. Now, what I want you to do is I want you to pause this video and I want you to see if you can draw a red X over each box. I'll give you a hint. We're going to start this way. G2D dot, oops, set color. Color red. And then we're going to make a line. G2D, draw a line, and I'm going to start my line at these same values, x origin, y origin, x end, y end. Now, if this one is going to draw over the first box, how am I going to draw the first line over the second box? I'll run this so you can see it. I'll go 50 and 50, 150, 150, 250, 300. And you can see that first box has a line over it. We want to draw a line from here to here. Then we want to draw another line from here to here and here to here. Think about how you can rearrange the x and y variables and how you can use the horizontal and vertical shifts to make this work. Take a few minutes. Try this out, pause the video, and come back when you're done. All right, welcome back. You can see I have two red X's over my boxes. Hopefully you figured out how to do this. Let's just take a look. I did it right starting here. Set color red. I drew my first line, X origin, Y origin, X end, Y end. Then I drew my second line, which was going to be from X origin plus X shift to Y origin plus Y shift. So it's the same values as these, because it's going to be my up left to down right line, but I'm just shifting it down by the required shift, the X shift and Y shift for the start and for the end. Now, the second line is going to be the other diagonal, the one that's going to go from top right to bottom left. I'm going to start at X end because I want it to be the far right side of my rectangle. And then it's going to be at Y origin because I want it to be at the top. So that's my first point, at right and top. This is my end of the line. Bottom, Y end, and left, X origin. Okay? And then for the second other diagonal line, I'm going to do my x shift and y shift added to those 4 values. So I'll leave this on screen for just a second so you can get it. And there you have it. This is a little bit about playing with variables. I'm going to do one more video on this file, and I'm going to add some drawstrings that are going to draw the ordered pairs coordinates for the origins of these boxes. Thanks for watching.